Saint Thomas the Apostle, known to history as Doubting Thomas, stands as one of Christianity's most misunderstood figures. Born in the 1st century in Galilee, Thomas was a Jewish fisherman who became one of Jesus Christ's 12 apostles. His Hebrew name was likely Judas, but he's remembered by his Aramaic nickname Thomas, meaning twin, though history never tells us who his twin was. The Gospel of John gives us our clearest glimpse of Thomas, a man of deep loyalty, practical skepticism, and ultimately profound faith. While popular culture remembers him for doubting Christ's resurrection, the full story reveals a missionary who carried Christianity further than perhaps any other apostle, traveling thousands of miles from Jerusalem to the southern tip of India, where he established churches that survive to this day. This is the true, complete story of St. Thomas. The New Testament actually shows Thomas as one of Jesus' bravest followers. In John 11:16, when Jesus announced plans to return to Judea, where religious authorities wanted to kill him, Thomas declared to the other disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." This wasn't doubt, this was courage bordering on fatalism. Thomas appears again in John 14, asking Jesus, "Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way?" A question that prompted Jesus' famous response, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." The doubting moment came after the resurrection. Thomas had been absent when Jesus first appeared to the disciples. When told Christ had risen, Thomas insisted, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." 8 days later, Jesus appeared specifically for Thomas, inviting him to touch the wounds. Thomas's response, "My Lord and my God," became the most explicit declaration of Christ's divinity in the Gospels. Jesus replied, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." This wasn't condemnation, but recognition of Thomas's transformation from empirical skeptic to absolute believer. After Christ's ascension around 30-33 AD, the apostles received the Holy Spirit at Pentecost and began spreading Christianity. Early Christian tradition, particularly the Acts of Thomas, written in the 3rd century, tells us the apostles cast lots to determine who would evangelize which regions. Thomas drew India, the furthest, most daunting assignment. According to these accounts, Thomas initially resisted, saying, "I cannot go there," until Jesus appeared to him in a vision. The historical context is crucial. By the 1st century, trade routes between the Roman Empire and India were well established. The monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean were mapped, and merchant ships regularly sailed from Egyptian ports to India's Malabar coast. Jewish trading communities already existed in Indian port cities. Thomas wouldn't have been traveling into complete unknown territory, but into a sophisticated civilization with its own ancient religions. Hinduism and Buddhism were already well developed. Thomas departed from Jerusalem sometime around 50-52 AD, beginning a journey that would span over 3,000 miles. Thomas's journey likely followed the established maritime trade route. Historical evidence suggests he traveled through Mesopotamia, possibly preaching in Persian territories before reaching a port, likely Charax-Spasinu, at the head of the Persian Gulf, or traveling overland to an Arabian seaport. Some traditions claim he sailed with an Indian merchant named Abanes, who was purchasing skilled labor for an Indian king. The voyage across the Arabian Sea would have taken weeks, dependent on monsoon winds that blew southwest toward India from June to September. Thomas would have landed somewhere on India's western coast, either in what's now Kerala or further north in Gujarat. Early Syriac Christian sources, including the 3rd century Doctrine of Addai, confirm apostolic missions reached as far as India. The 4th century historian Eusebius wrote that the apostle Bartholomew brought the Gospel of Matthew to India and mentions Thomas's mission there. Roman records document extensive trade with Indian kingdoms. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a 1st century Greek text, describes Indian ports, goods, and rulers in detail, confirming that such a journey was entirely feasible for Thomas. According to the ancient Marthoma Christians of India, whose oral and written traditions date back centuries, Thomas landed at Cranganore, modern-day Kodangalur, in Kerala in 52 AD. This wasn't a wilderness, but a thriving port city in the Chera kingdom, wealthy from pepper and spice trade. The region had an existing Jewish community called the Cochin Jews, who had settled there possibly as early as Solomon's time. Thomas would have found a cosmopolitan society, Dravidian Hindu culture with Brahmin priests, Buddhist monasteries, and Jewish synagogues coexisting in relative peace. The Chera kings were literate, maintaining diplomatic relations with Rome and other kingdoms. Thomas began his ministry among both Jewish settlers and local Indians. Tradition records he first converted several Jewish families and then began preaching to Hindus, particularly among the upper caste Nambudiri Brahmins, a historically controversial claim, but one persistent in Kerala Christian tradition. The Acts of Thomas describes him as a carpenter and architect, skills he allegedly used to gain entrance to the royal court. Within months of his arrival, Thomas had established the first Christian community in India. Between 52 and 70 AD, Thomas established 7 churches across Kerala, a claim documented in multiple independent sources spanning centuries. These churches were in Cranganore, Palayur, Kotakavu, Paravur, Kokamangalam, Niranam, Nilakal, Chayal, and Kollam. Each location was chosen strategically, near trade routes, in areas with Jewish communities, or in centers of Brahmin influence. The most dramatic conversion story involves Palayur, where Thomas allegedly challenged local Brahmins performing a Vedic fire ritual. According to tradition, he extinguished the sacred fire by sprinkling holy water and converted several Brahmin families, ancestors of modern Palayur Christians who still maintain distinct liturgical traditions. Archaeological evidence supports early Christian presence in Kerala. Ancient stone crosses with Pahlavi, Persian inscriptions have been found, and the distinctive Syrian Christian copper plates granted by Kerala kings date back centuries. The community Thomas founded used Syriac in their liturgy, the language of the Assyrian Church, indicating their connection to the broader Eastern Christian world. These weren't isolated converts, but organized churches with deacons, priests, and bishops following Thomas's departure. The community called themselves Nazrani, Nazarenes, and maintained their faith through centuries without European contact. What did Thomas actually preach in India? The evidence suggests he adapted his message while maintaining core Christian doctrine. In a Hindu-Buddhist context that understood karma, reincarnation, and multiple divine manifestations, Thomas proclaimed one God, one incarnation, and salvation through Christ's death and resurrection. The Acts of Thomas, while containing legendary elements, preserves early traditions about his teaching style. He emphasized asceticism, which resonated with Indian spiritual traditions, celibacy as a high calling, care for the poor, and rejection of caste distinctions. This last point was revolutionary in Brahmin-dominated society. Thomas's approach appears to have been confrontational with Hindu rituals, but respectful of philosophical inquiry. Unlike later European missionaries, he didn't have institutional power. He converted through persuasion, miracles, according to tradition, and the example of community life. The Syrian Christian liturgy he established incorporated some Indian cultural elements. Believers sat on the floor, removed shoes in church, and used coconut oil lamps, practices that continue today. Theologically, the Thomas Christians maintained Orthodox Christology, following the Assyrian Church of the East and later splitting between Catholic and Orthodox traditions. Thomas ordained local leaders, many from Brahmin families, creating an indigenous church leadership that helped Christianity survive in India for 2 millennia. Around 70 A.D., Thomas traveled across South India to the eastern Coromandel coast, what's now Tamil Nadu. The reasons for this journey are debated. Tradition says he was invited by King Gundaforus to build a palace, while other accounts suggest he was fleeing persecution in Kerala. The journey would have been arduous, crossing the Western Ghats mountain range, traveling through kingdoms and forests for several hundred miles. Thomas established a presence in Mylapore, modern-day Chennai, a major port city of the Pandya kingdom. Here he encountered a different cultural context, Tamil Hindu civilization, with its Shaivite and Vaishnavite traditions, Dravidian temple culture, and a sophisticated philosophical tradition documented in Sangam literature. The Tamil traditions about Thomas are preserved by both Christians and Hindus. The Tirumattulai Vale Pillayar Kovil temple supposedly stands where Thomas challenged Hindu priests. Local folklore, recorded by Hindu sources, mentions a foreign sage who preached a new doctrine and performed miracles. Unlike Kerala, Thomas's mission in Tamil Nadu appears to have been shorter and more conflicted. He gained converts, including some from influential families, but also aroused opposition from Brahmin priests who saw him as a threat to the established religious order. The circumstances of Thomas's death are recorded in multiple early sources with remarkable consistency. Tradition states that around 72 A.D., Thomas was praying in a cave on a small mountain outside Mylapore, now called St. Thomas Mount. The Roman Catholic tradition claims he was martyred while praying before a cross, run through with a lance by soldiers sent by a local king or Hindu priests. The Eastern Orthodox tradition states he was killed with arrows and spears. The Syrian Christian tradition records that a Brahmin pierced him with a lance while he prayed. All accounts agree on the location and approximate date. The motive was religious persecution. Thomas's successful conversions of high-caste Hindus and his criticism of idol worship had made him powerful enemies. The site of his martyrdom became immediately sacred to local Christians. Archaeological excavations at St. Thomas Mount have revealed the cave with ancient crosses carved into the stone, inscriptions in Pahlavi script, and clear evidence of continuous Christian veneration. The cross Thomas allegedly prayed before, the bleeding cross, was later removed to Mylapore Cathedral. His body was initially buried at Sandtome Beach in Mylapore, where local Christians established a shrine. This wasn't hidden or forgotten, but became a pilgrimage site that existed continuously through the centuries. The circumstances of Thomas's death are recorded in multiple early sources with remarkable consistency. Tradition states that around 72 A.D., Thomas was praying in a cave on a small mountain outside Mylapore, now called St. Thomas Mount. The Roman Catholic tradition claims he was martyred while praying before a cross, run through with a lance by soldiers sent by a local king or Hindu priests. The Eastern Orthodox tradition states he was killed with arrows and spears. The Syrian Christian tradition records that a Brahmin pierced him with a lance while he prayed. All accounts agree on the location and approximate date. The motive was religious persecution. Thomas's successful conversions of high-caste Hindus and his criticism of idol worship had made him powerful enemies. The site of his martyrdom became immediately sacred to local Christians. Archaeological excavations at St. Thomas Mount have revealed a cave with ancient crosses carved into the stone, inscriptions in Pahlavi script, and clear evidence of continuous Christian veneration. The cross Thomas allegedly prayed before, the bleeding cross, was later removed to Mylapore Cathedral. His body was initially buried at Santome Beach in Mylapore, where local Christians established a shrine. This wasn't hidden or forgotten, but became a pilgrimage site that existed continuously through the centuries. How much of the Thomas tradition is historically verifiable? Let's examine the evidence honestly. Contemporary first-century sources don't mention Thomas in India, but they don't mention most apostles' missions anywhere. The earliest clear reference is in the Acts of Thomas, written around 200 to 220 AD in Syriac, which contains legendary elements but preserves earlier traditions. Eusebius, 263 to 339 AD, references Thomas in India. St. Ephrem, 306 to 373 AD, mentions Thomas's tomb in Edessa. The doctrine of Addai, 400s AD, confirms the India mission. Church historian Sozomen, 400 to 450 AD, describes Thomas Christians in India. Most compellingly, the existence of the Malabar Christian community itself, documented by multiple independent sources before any European contact, demands explanation. Marco Polo in 1288 visited Thomas's tomb in Mylapore and reported an active pilgrimage site. Portuguese explorers in 1498 encountered thousands of Christians in Kerala using ancient Syriac liturgy, claiming apostolic foundation. They existed independently of Rome or Constantinople. Archaeological evidence includes Persian crosses, Pahlavi inscriptions, and continuous site veneration. Scholarly consensus has shifted. While some details are legendary, the core claim that Thomas or an early Christian missionary reached India in the 1st century and established lasting churches is now considered historically probable by most historians of early Christianity. Critics argue the tradition was invented to give prestige to Indian Christians, but this doesn't explain the consistent traditions across multiple independent sources or the archaeological evidence. What happened to Thomas's community after his death? The Thomas Christians maintained their faith through extraordinary circumstances. They remained connected to the Assyrian Church of the East through Persian bishops who traveled to India, a journey requiring months. When Islam spread through Persia in the 7th-8th centuries, cutting direct contact, the Indian Christians preserved their traditions independently. They became a distinct caste-like community in Kerala society, the Syrian Christians, economically successful traders and landowners who maintained equality within their community while navigating caste-based Hindu society around them. Hindu kings granted them privileges documented in ancient copper plate charters. The Martyrdom Christians built hundreds of churches across Kerala, developed a unique architectural style, and preserved Syriac liturgy even as their spoken language became Malayalam. They maintained their traditions for over 1,400 years before the Portuguese arrived in 1498. The Portuguese initially celebrated finding fellow Christians, but soon attempted to Latinize their liturgy and subject them to Roman authority. This sparked the Coonan Cross Oath of 1653, when thousands of Thomas Christians publicly rejected Portuguese ecclesiastical control. The community subsequently split into multiple denominations. Some aligned with Rome, Syro-Malabar Catholic, others maintained independence, Malankara Orthodox, Mar Thoma. Still others later joined Protestants. Today, over 6 million Thomas Christians live in Kerala alone, making Christianity the region's third-largest religion. How did the broader church remember Thomas? In Eastern Christianity, particularly Syriac, Armenian, and Eastern Orthodox traditions, Thomas has always been celebrated as the apostle to India and twin of Christ. His feast day, July 3rd, commemorates his death. The Syriac tradition composed numerous hymns about his missionary work. The Assyrian Church of the East maintained communication with Indian Christians for over a millennium, considering them part of their communion. In Western Christianity, Thomas received less attention until medieval times. The Roman Catholic Church initially knew little about India missions, but accepted Thomas's apostolate. The translation of relics to Ortona in 1258 increased Western devotion. Medieval writers like Marco Polo publicized Thomas's Indian tomb. The Portuguese discovery of Thomas Christians in 1498 shocked Europe. Here was proof of apostolic Christianity beyond European Christendom. The Protestant Reformation initially viewed Thomas traditions skeptically, but by the 19th century, Protestant missionaries in India encountered the Thomas Christian community and could no longer deny the tradition's antiquity. Today, Thomas is patron saint of India, architects, and blind people, in reference to his blindness before touching Christ's wounds. He appears in art typically holding a carpenter's square, representing his building profession, and a spear, instrument of martyrdom. His transformation from skeptic to believer makes him relatably human, a saint for doubters who seek honest faith. Let's address the controversies honestly. Some scholars argue Thomas in India is entirely legendary. They point out the Acts of Thomas contains fantastical elements, talking animals, magical contests, romantic subplots, making it unreliable. They note that no contemporary Roman, Jewish, or Indian sources mention Thomas. They suggest later Christians invented the tradition to explain the existing Indian Christian community, which might have been founded by later Syrian missionaries. However, this skeptical position has weaknesses. First, absence of contemporary evidence doesn't equal evidence of absence. We have no contemporary accounts of most apostles' missions. Second, the Acts of Thomas, while legendary in style, preserves geographical and cultural details about first-century India that suggest genuine knowledge, not invention. Third, multiple independent early sources confirm the tradition. Syriac, Greek, Latin, and Indian sources all tell similar stories. Fourth, the Thomas Christians themselves have maintained consistent oral and written traditions for 2 millennia. Fifth, why would later Christians invent a story about the most remote, least prestigious mission field? The scholarly consensus has thus moved toward qualified acceptance. Thomas, or a very early Christian missionary, likely did reach India in the 1st century. Those specific miracle stories are legendary embellishments. What's certain is that Christianity existed in India from very ancient times, independent of European missions, and that this community has always claimed Thomas as founder, a claim that deserves historical respect even if every detail can't be verified. Recent archaeology has provided tangible evidence for early Christianity in India. At St. Thomas Mount in Chennai, excavations have revealed a cave with ancient cross carvings, Pahlavi inscriptions dating to the 7th to 9th centuries, and evidence of continuous Christian worship. At Mylapore, beneath the Santomi Cathedral, archaeologists found a stone foundation consistent with early martyrium architecture, shrines built over martyrs' graves. In Muziris, Kerala, ancient Cranganore, one of Thomas's alleged landing sites, excavations have uncovered extensive Roman trade goods dating to the 1st century, proving intensive contact between Rome and Kerala during Thomas's lifetime. Ancient crosses found across Kerala show a distinctive style predating European arrival. Persian crosses with inscriptions in Pahlavi script and symbols showing Middle Eastern Christian influence. The Quillan copper plates, granted by a Chera king in the 9th century, document privileges given to Thomas Christians, proving their ancient presence and social status. At Palayor, one of Thomas's 7 churches, archaeological surveys have confirmed structural elements dating back at least to the 3rd to 4th centuries. Most significantly, the continuous veneration of specific sites, Thomas Mount, Mylapore Tomb, the 7 church locations, without interruption for 2 millennia, is itself powerful historical evidence. Sites don't maintain pilgrimage status for centuries unless founded on genuine tradition. While archaeology cannot prove Thomas personally was in India, it overwhelmingly confirms that Christianity was established there in very ancient times, exactly as Thomas Christians claim. Thomas's impact on Indian culture extends beyond Christianity. The Thomas Christians became a significant economic force in Kerala, dominating the spice trade, owning plantations, and establishing educational institutions. They introduced Syrian Christian architecture that influenced Kerala building styles, distinctive sloping roofs, wooden construction, and interior layouts. Their script, Syriac, influenced Malayalam language development. The tradition of Christian-Hindu cooperation in Kerala, where both communities coexisted more peacefully than in many other regions, may partly stem from Christianity's ancient roots there, making it native rather than foreign. Thomas appears in Hindu folklore and traditions, sometimes called Thondachan in Tamil. Hindu sources acknowledge him as a foreign sage, even if they dispute his message. Several Hindu temples have legends about confrontations with Thomas. This suggests genuine historical interaction, not later invention. The Thomas Christian community also preserved unique cultural practices, arranged marriages within the community, distinctive cuisine blending Syrian and Kerala traditions, martial arts training, Kalari Payatu, and traditional dress that merged Middle Eastern and Indian styles. Today, Thomas Christians occupy prominent positions in Indian society. They're overrepresented in education, medicine, business, and even entertainment. The legacy isn't just religious, but cultural and social. Thomas didn't just bring Christianity to India, he helped create a distinct Indo-Christian culture that has enriched Indian civilization for 2,000 years. The Thomas Christians preserved distinct liturgical traditions that reveal their origins. They used the East Syrian Rite, the liturgy of the Assyrian Church of the East, in Syriac language, not Greek or Latin. Their liturgy included ancient hymns attributed to Saint Ephraim and other Syriac fathers. The Kurbana, Eucharist, followed Persian Christian tradition with distinctive prayers and rituals. They used leavened bread, unlike Western Christians, and maintained Eastern practices like infant communion. Their church calendar celebrated saints from the Syriac tradition largely unknown in the West. Theologically, the original Thomas Christians followed the Assyrian Church's Christology, emphasizing the distinction between Christ's divine and human natures, though not as extremely as Nestorius. This put them at odds with both Catholic and Orthodox positions, but proved their genuine connection to Persian Christianity. They maintained ancient practices like anointing with holy oil, myron, epiclesis, invoking the Holy Spirit over the Eucharist, and distinctive fasting rules. Their bishops' vestments resembled Persian designs, not European ones. Even their church architecture, east-facing altars, iconostasis-like screens, and specific sanctuary layouts followed Eastern patterns. When Portuguese Catholics tried to Latinize these traditions in the 16th to 17th centuries, the resistance was fierce, because these weren't optional customs, but ancient apostolic traditions. Today, various Thomas Christian denominations have maintained or restored these ancient liturgical practices, seeing them as direct links to Thomas himself and proof of their apostolic foundation independent of Rome or Constantinople. Thomas appears differently in Eastern and Western Christian art. In Syrian Christian iconography, he's depicted as a bearded Eastern figure in simple robes, often holding a scroll representing his teachings and a spear representing martyrdom. The Indian Thomas Christian tradition shows him in a more local context, sometimes with Indian architectural elements, palm trees, or even in traditional Indian artistic styles. Western medieval art typically shows Thomas in the doubting moment, touching Christ's wounds, making this his defining image in Europe. Renaissance and later Catholic art portrayed him as a European apostle, often ignoring his Indian mission entirely. Eastern Orthodox icons show him among the apostles, emphasizing his apostleship over his doubt. Indian Catholic art from the Portuguese period onwards tried to merge European artistic conventions with local context, sometimes creating awkward hybrids. Modern Thomas Christian art has reclaimed his Indian identity, depicting him landing in Kerala, preaching to Brahmins, or establishing the 7 churches. The most powerful images show his martyrdom on St. Thomas Mount, a truly Indian Christian narrative. The evolution of Thomas's artistic representation reveals changing theological emphases: Western focus on doubt and belief, Eastern focus on apostolic mission, Indian focus on local founding and martyrdom. Each tradition has emphasized the aspects of Thomas most meaningful to their context, but all recognize him as an apostle who brought Christianity to new frontiers through courage and conviction. When Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, the encounter between Portuguese Catholics and Thomas Christians was initially joyful. Both sides celebrated finding fellow Christians, but joy quickly turned to conflict. The Portuguese were shocked that these Christians didn't recognize papal authority, used Syriac instead of Latin, had married priests, and followed heretical Assyrian theology. The Portuguese saw themselves as bringing true Christianity to correct these schismatics. Starting in 1510, Portuguese colonial authorities, backed by the Inquisition in Goa, began forcibly Latinizing Thomas Christians. They burned Syriac liturgical books, arrested Assyrian bishops, and imposed Latin rites. They declared Syriac heretical and demanded submission to Rome. They appointed Portuguese bishops over Thomas Christian communities without consulting them. This cultural religious imperialism reached a climax in 1599 at the Synod of Daimper, where Portuguese Archbishop Alexis de Menezes systematically destroyed Thomas Christian autonomy. Ancient Syriac manuscripts were burned, traditional practices banned, and communities forced to accept Roman Catholic doctrine and governance. The Thomas Christians resisted. In 1653, at the famous Cunin Cross Oath in Matancherry, thousands of believers publicly swore never to submit to Portuguese authority again, holding a rope tied to a stone cross. This split the community. Some remained Catholic under Portuguese authority, forming today's Syro-Malabar Church, while others maintained independence, eventually forming various Orthodox and independent churches. The Portuguese period was traumatic, but also inadvertently proved the Thomas Christians' ancient origins. Their fierce resistance to Latinization only made sense if they genuinely possessed ancient traditions worth preserving. Today's Thomas Christians are divided into multiple denominations, each claiming authentic succession from St. Thomas. The Syro-Malabar Catholic Church, approximately 4 million members, reconciled with Rome, but maintains Eastern liturgy and married priests in lower orders, the largest Eastern Catholic Church. The Syro-Malankara Catholic Church, approximately 500,000, also recognizes papal authority but follows West Syrian rather than East Syrian liturgy. The Malankara Orthodox Syrian Church, approximately 2.5 million, maintains independence from foreign authority, recognizing the Syriac Orthodox Patriarch as spiritual head but governing itself. The Malankara Mar Thoma Syrian Church, approximately 1 million, underwent Protestant Reformation in the 19th century, maintaining ancient liturgy while adopting Reformed theology. The Assyrian Church of the East in India maintains the original East Syrian tradition. Smaller groups include the Malabar Independent Syrian Church and various Pentecostal Thomas Christian groups. These divisions might seem like fragmentation, but they actually demonstrate the vitality of Thomas Christian tradition. Each group seeks authentic connection to apostolic origins while adapting to changing contexts. What unites them is pride in Thomas's apostolate, continuation of Syriac liturgical elements, distinctive cultural identity, and the conviction that Indian Christianity isn't derivative of European missions, but has independent apostolic foundation. Despite denominational differences, Thomas Christians generally intermarry, share cultural practices, and maintain community cohesion. The divisions are primarily ecclesiastical, not social or cultural. Why does Thomas matter for global Christianity? First, he represents the faith's universal reach from its very beginning. Christianity wasn't a Western religion that later spread east. It went in all directions simultaneously. Thomas's mission proves the gospel reached the edges of the known world within decades of Christ's resurrection. Second, he demonstrates Christianity's adaptability. The faith took root in radically different cultures, Jewish, Greek, Indian, while maintaining core beliefs. Third, the Thomas Christians show that Christianity can thrive independently of European power structures and colonial backing. They survived for 1,500 years without European contact or political support. Fourth, Thomas challenges the doubting Thomas stereotype that reduces him to skepticism. His journey to India shows a man of profound courage and commitment who traveled further than perhaps any apostle to fulfill the Great Commission. Fifth, his story complicates simple narratives about Christianity as a Western religion or colonialism's gift to Asia. Christianity was in India centuries before it dominated Europe, established through persuasion, not conquest. Finally, Thomas represents Christianity of the margins, not based in Rome or Constantinople, but in distant lands, maintaining ancient traditions precisely because they were forgotten by powerful centers. His legacy challenges us to recognize that Christian history is far more diverse, ancient, and globally distributed than Eurocentric narratives suggest. Thomas was Christianity's first truly global missionary, and his success helped make Christianity a world religion rather than a Mediterranean sect. The Acts of Thomas requires careful analysis. Written in Syriac around 200 to 220 AD, it's our most detailed account of Thomas's ministry, but it's not straightforward history. It's theological narrative, mixing fact, legend, and moral teaching. The text contains fantastical elements, a talking donkey, magical contests, a dragon asking for baptism, and romantic subplots. These signal we're reading hagiography, not documentary. However, dismissing it entirely is a mistake. The text contains accurate geographical and cultural details about first-century India. Names of ports, descriptions of royal courts, details about trade routes, suggesting the author had genuine knowledge of India, possibly through oral traditions from Indian Christians. The core narrative, Thomas traveling to India, preaching, establishing churches, and being martyred, appears in too many independent sources to be pure invention. Scholars now view the Acts of Thomas as preserving authentic historical memories wrapped in legendary embellishment. The method is similar to ancient Greco-Roman biographies, which freely mixed history and legend to communicate deeper truths. The text's theological themes, asceticism, rejection of worldly power, and Christ's presence through the apostle reflect real early Christian concerns. Modern historians extract the historical kernel by comparing the Acts with other early sources, archaeology, and the existence of the Thomas Christian community itself. The text isn't reliable for specific details, but provides valuable evidence for the broader tradition of Thomas in India being ancient, widespread, and geographically specific, not a vague legend invented centuries later. Thomas's legacy survives in active pilgrimage sites. The San Tome Cathedral in Chennai, rebuilt multiple times over Thomas's original tomb, attracts thousands of pilgrims annually, Christians of all denominations and even curious Hindus and Muslims. Pilgrims venerate the tomb, attend Mass in the Syro-Malabar Rite, and visit the attached museum displaying archaeological finds and historical documents. St. Thomas Mount, 3 miles from the cathedral, features the cave where Thomas prayed before martyrdom. Pilgrims climbed 1,346 steps to reach the summit shrine, which houses a fragment of the alleged bleeding cross and offers panoramic views of Chennai. The cross supposedly bled when struck by a skeptic, though this miracle story is clearly legendary. In Kerala, the 7 churches Thomas founded remain active parishes. Palayur, claiming to be the oldest church in India, celebrates its foundation in 52 AD with annual festivals. Naranam, Kotakavu, and the other churches maintain ancient traditions and welcome pilgrims seeking connection to apostolic Christianity. In Ortona, Italy, the Basilica of St. Thomas houses his relics in a beautiful crypt, attracting both Italian Catholics and visiting Indian Christians. These pilgrimage sites aren't merely historical curiosities, but living centers of faith, where believers experience continuity with the apostolic age. The persistence of devotion across centuries, cultures, and denominations testifies to Thomas's enduring significance. Modern pilgrims walking where Thomas walked encounter not just history, but ongoing spiritual tradition. Thomas has become an ecumenical saint, honored across Christian divisions. Catholics venerate him as an apostle and martyr, with feasts on July 3rd, traditional, and December 21st, transfer of relics. Orthodox Christians celebrate him as equal to the apostles, with special devotion in Syrian and Indian Orthodox churches. Protestant Christians, while initially skeptical of Thomas traditions, have come to respect the historical evidence and recognize Thomas Christians as genuine apostolic communities. Anglican, Lutheran, and Methodist churches now include Thomas in their liturgical calendars. The Assyrian Church of the East, the oldest Christian tradition in continuous existence, considers Thomas one of its foundational apostles alongside Addai and Mari. Most significantly, Thomas Christians themselves, despite their denominational divisions, unite in venerating their founding apostle. Ecumenical services at Thomas's tomb on his feast day bring together Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestant Thomas Christians in shared worship, something rare in India's often fractious Christian landscape. Thomas's legacy transcends later theological disputes because his mission occurred before those divisions existed. He represents primitive, undivided Christianity, when apostles simply proclaimed Christ's resurrection without the theological elaborations that would later divide East and West, Catholic and Protestant. In an era seeking Christian unity, Thomas offers common ground, an apostle all traditions respect, whose courage and faithfulness all can admire, whose successful evangelization all celebrate. Thomas's relationship with Indian religions offers insights for interfaith dialogue. According to tradition, Thomas engaged Hindu Brahmins in philosophical debate, challenged their rituals, but apparently respected their intellectual traditions. He converted not through coercion, but persuasion. He had no political power, no military backing, just his message and, believers say, miraculous signs. The Thomas Christians developed a unique model of coexistence with Hinduism, maintaining clear religious boundaries while integrating socially and culturally. They didn't try to destroy Hindu temples or forcibly convert. They established their communities and let their way of life attract others. Carol is religious pluralism, where Hindu, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities coexisted with less violence than in many other regions, may partly result from this pattern established by Thomas Christians. Modern Hindu-Christian dialogue in India often references Thomas as a bridge figure, a Christian saint whom Hindus acknowledged existed even if they dispute his claims. Some Hindu scholars argue Thomas's message resonated because it paralleled bhakti, devotional movements in Hinduism, personal relationship with the divine, grace over ritual, devotion over caste. This creates conversation opportunities. However, Thomas was also confrontational toward Hindu practices he saw as idolatrous. He wasn't practicing religious syncretism, but authentic Christian witness with cultural sensitivity. The lesson isn't that Thomas compromised doctrine, but that he engaged seriously with Indian spirituality, learned the culture, and presented Christianity in ways Indians could evaluate on its own terms. Academic views on Thomas have evolved significantly. Early Western scholars, 18th to 19th centuries, dismissed the India tradition as pious legend, assuming Christianity only reached India much later through Persian missions. This skepticism had colonial undertones, assuming ancient Indians couldn't have encountered Christianity without European mediation. Mid-20th century scholarship began reassessing. Scholars like A.C. Perumalal, Leslie Brown, and A.M. Mundadan carefully examined Syrian, Latin, Greek, and Indian sources, finding more consistency than previously recognized. Archaeological discoveries, Persian crosses, inscriptions, ancient church foundations provided physical evidence for very early Christianity in India. Trade route studies proved Roman-Indian contact was extensive in the 1st century, making apostolic missions entirely feasible. Recent scholarship generally accepts that Christianity reached India very early, probably in the 1st century, though debate continues whether Thomas personally went or later missionaries established communities in his name. Scholars like J.N. Farquhar, Stephen Neal, and more recently Ilaria Ramelli have argued for the essential historicity of the Thomas tradition while acknowledging legendary embellishments. Critics like Robert Eric Freikenberg remain more skeptical, arguing the tradition developed later and was projected backward. The current academic consensus is cautiously positive. While we cannot verify every detail, the broad outlines, early Christian mission to India, establishment of communities in Kerala, martyrdom tradition, continuous community existence are historically credible. Thomas's mission is now taught in academic courses on early Christian expansion, early Indian history, and global Christianity. What does Thomas's story mean for contemporary Christians? First, it challenges cultural Christianity. Thomas left everything familiar to bring the gospel to a completely foreign culture. He didn't demand Indians become Mediterranean Jews. He translated the gospel into new cultural forms while maintaining core truth. Modern cross-cultural missions can learn from this approach. Second, Thomas embodies faith that questions. His doubt wasn't unbelief, but a search for certainty. His encounter with the risen Christ wasn't blind faith, but evidence-based conviction that then sustained him through incredible hardship. This validates intellectual struggle as part of authentic faith. Third, Thomas demonstrates that Christianity's global reach wasn't modern colonialism's product, but the faith's original impulse, the Great Commission taken seriously from the beginning. This reclaims Christian mission from colonial distortions. Fourth, the Thomas Christians prove Christianity can flourish without political power or cultural dominance. They survived for 1,500 years as a minority without state backing. This offers hope for Christianity in post-Christian Western contexts and in regions where Christians are minorities. Fifth, Thomas's martyrdom reminds us that authentic faith costs. He died for his convictions, as millions have since. Finally, Thomas's transformation from practical skeptic to courageous missionary to faithful martyr shows that anyone can be called to extraordinary service. You don't have to be perfect, you have to be willing. Thomas's journey from doubt to devotion to death mirrors every Christian spiritual journey in accelerated form. Despite 2 millennia, mysteries remain. We still don't know Thomas's twin's identity. Was it literal or symbolic? The precise route of his journey remains uncertain. Did he sail directly or travel overland through Persia first? The extent of his ministry is unclear. Did he establish only 7 churches or more? Was he in India continuously, or did he travel back to the Middle East? The exact circumstances of his martyrdom are recorded differently in various sources. Was it soldiers, Brahmins, or a mob who killed him? The early centuries of Thomas Christian history remain obscure. How did they maintain orthodoxy without consistent episcopal oversight? Future research directions include more extensive archaeological excavations at Thomas sites, potentially finding earlier physical evidence, comparative studies of Thomas Christian liturgy and theology with other ancient Eastern churches to map development, DNA studies of Thomas Christian communities to understand migration patterns and connections to Middle Eastern populations, linguistic analysis of ancient Malayalam Christian texts to trace Syriac influence, interdisciplinary studies combining history, archaeology, anthropology, and theology. Climate change and urban development threaten some Thomas sites. Sea level rise affects coastal churches. Chennai's growth encroaches on St. Thomas Mount. Preserving these sites for future research is urgent. The Thomas Christian community itself is changing, diaspora spreading globally, denominational boundaries softening, younger generations questioning traditions. How Thomas's legacy evolves in the 21st century remains to be seen. But after 2,000 years, Thomas continues to fascinate, inspire, and challenge. Evidence that his story, whether we accept every detail or not, carries profound truth. St. Thomas the Apostle, fisherman, skeptic, questioner, believer, missionary, martyr, traveled further than any other apostle, established Christianity in a civilization as ancient as his own, and founded a community that survived 2 millennia without European support. Whether you accept every miraculous detail or take a more cautious historical approach, the evidence is overwhelming. Christianity reached India very early. Communities claiming Thomas as founder have existed continuously for 2,000 years, and these communities preserved ancient traditions, proving their antiquity. Thomas's legacy isn't just historical, but living. 6 million Thomas Christians in India today, millions more in diaspora, and countless Christians globally who find in his story encouragement for their own doubts, questions, and journeys of faith. He's honored in churches from Rome to Kerala, from ancient Syrian villages to modern American parishes. His relics rest in Ortona. His tomb draws pilgrims in Chennai, and his 7 churches still function in Kerala. More profoundly, Thomas reminds us that Christianity was never meant to be culturally confined. It was always intended as a message for all peoples, all cultures, all continents. He took that message seriously and paid with his life. In an age of religious division, Thomas stands as a unifying figure honored across denominational lines. In an age of religious doubt, Thomas validates honest questioning as the path to deeper faith. In an age of global Christianity, Thomas proves the faith's universal reach was there from the beginning. St. Thomas, doubter, believer, traveler, martyr, apostle, whose journey from the shores of Galilee to the beaches of India remains one of Christianity's most remarkable and inspiring stories.